Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library, and I have a great story to tell you. Tonight, we are going to explore the history of various ancient, or at least old mysterious objects that are called out-of-place artifacts. They are considered out of place because they were found in unusual contexts or suggest a level of technical advancement from ancient cultures that challenge conventional historical chronology, or sometimes because they hint at contacts between cultures that were not thought to have ever been in contact. In other words, these are artifacts that should not exist. Should not exist provided they are real and were correctly dated and appraised, as this is generally at the core of their mysteries. Fakes and hoaxes abound in this field. I will tell you about various cases of forgeries or biased interpretations that sometimes made news for a short period or a long time. Some of them retained a bit of fame even after being debunked, like the so-called crystal skulls, supposedly from pre-Columbian America. Many of these cases have explanations. They could have been placed where they were found by travelers centuries or even millennia after they were made. But there is a small number of such artifacts that retain an element of mystery or invite us to rethink our view of a culture's technical advancement. I will focus on some of them, including the Shroud of Turin, an ancient large cloth that contained an image resembling a photographic negative. It was kept and still is kept as a relic because it was believed to be the burial shroud in which Jesus Christ was wrapped after his crucifixion. Various investigation methods, including radiocarbon dating, established that the shroud was most probably made during the Middle Ages, but it still retains mystery, starting on how this negative image could have been created. I will also tell you about the Iron Pillar of Delhi, a large metal column that was made around the 4th century AD. What is surprising about it is its rust resistance due to its composition, which, if intentional, would suggest that ancient India had much more advanced knowledge and expertise in metallurgy than previously thought. I will also discuss the Antikythera Mechanism, an ancient form of mechanical computer created around the 2nd or 1st century BC, probably by ancient Greeks, which reveals a design capacity and a degree of sophistication in engineering that was not thought possible. But first, I would like to let you know that we have a Patreon page for those who wish to and can support this project, get more of it, and listen ad-free on your favorite podcast app. Patreon is a platform that allows you to contribute directly to our work financially. If you join our Patreon, which is possible for as little as $3, £3, or €3 a month, you will gain access to more than a dozen exclusive episodes. We add new ones every month, and you can listen and download all the episodes with and without background sounds. You can also get advance releases on Fridays instead of Sundays, surveys, and obviously this is the best way to let us know your feedback, requests, and wishes about Lights Out Library. We have added a link to Patreon in the description of the episode. But before we begin, let's take a moment together to prepare for our journey ahead. If you'd like, gently close your eyes and let your daily concerns drift away. Find a position that feels natural and cozy. Perhaps make small adjustments until you're perfectly comfortable. Now, draw in a deep, nourishing breath, and as you release it softly, notice how your body responds. Feel the warmth flowing from your shoulders down through your neck, melting away any tension. Let your facial muscles become soft, your jaw loose, your fingers naturally open, and your legs completely at ease. As you settle into this peaceful state, my voice will be your gentle companion as we begin our exploration together. To begin with, I'm going to tell you about these mysteries called crystal skulls. During the 19th century, interest in ancient civilizations of the world grew exponentially in Europe and America. This interest extended beyond familiar Mediterranean and Middle Eastern cultures from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome to more mysterious or exotic cultures from faraway regions of the world, including East and South Asia, Africa, and America. There was scientific interest from archaeologists and historians, backed by universities and museums, trying to grow their collections. And also private interest came from amateurs, travelers, and collectors. The thrill of discovering ancient artifacts and secrets in tombs lost in ruins, covered by jungle or desert sand, was exciting. It didn't take long before it turned into a business. While this trade wasn't entirely new, the trafficking or procurement of Egyptian mummies or supposed Christian relics was something that had existed since the Middle Ages. It took on a whole new dimension, often with sad consequences. Many sites were literally looted before they could be studied, stripped of their statues and any artifacts that could interest museums or collectors. These objects were purchased or stolen, then shipped, sometimes smuggled, to Western Europe or America, where they ended up in many public and private collections. Antique dealers specialized in this business and provided wealthy collectors with these evocative or mysterious artifacts. It was in this context that small crystal skulls, purportedly from Mesoamerica and attributed to Aztec or Maya civilizations, appeared on the market. These artifacts were very different from known pre-Columbian, Aztec, and Maya artifacts. While various objects from these civilizations were already well known, from ceramics to masks and jewelry, crystal sculptures like these were unprecedented. Maybe several dealers may have offered them, but the most prominent was a French antiquarian specialized in Mesoamerican antiques, Eugène Bobin. He was regarded as an authority in the field because he had spent many years in Mexico and spoke fluent Spanish and Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs that was and still is spoken in central Mexico. He had provided many authentic pre-Columbian antiques and was part of a scientific commission too, which made him a credible and well-established antiquarian. In 1870, at age 37, he opened a shop in Paris and managed this business between Mexico and France for 3 decades. Among other objects, he occasionally offered these crystal skulls. While the exact number he sold is unknown, but several that are now in museums have been traced back to him. For example, one such skull is now at the British Museum in London. This particular skull appeared in Vauban's shop in 1881. He attempted to sell it as an Aztec artifact to Mexico's National Museum, but the offer was rejected. He then turned to New York City, where he sold it to an American entrepreneur. After changing hands, the skull ended up in an auction where it was purchased by Tiffany & Co., the jewelry house. Tiffany subsequently sold it to the British Museum in 1897. 3 other skulls were sold to a French ethnographer, who donated them to the Museum of Man in Paris, an ethnography museum. These skulls were not very famous at the time. They were known essentially in a small circle of archaeologists, antiquarians, collectors, and museum personnel. They raised a question, a mystery, and this is why they can be associated with the group of out-of-place artifacts. They were very different from other Aztec or Maya artifacts because no other carved crystals like these were known, and because of their precision and craftsmanship. They were made of quartz, and that type of quartz is not easy to work with or carve. It requires precision metal tools, even using diamonds to overcome the hardness of quartz without breaking it. Their polishing was also technically complicated, and this puts the skulls apart from other pre-Columbian creations. The technical complexity and craftsmanship were hard to reconcile with other objects produced by these cultures and with what was known of their technical advancement. If real, these skulls would have forced the scientific community to reconsider the technical advancement of pre-Columbian craftsmen or discover unknown techniques that could have given this result with the tools known in the region centuries ago. In short, the existence of these skulls was a real mystery, and this could be why in the early 20th century, as they were now exhibited in major museums, the skulls began to rise to fame. First, because of the interest of occultists who started to claim that they could produce a variety of miracles, from curing diseases to killing people at a distance. The adoption of crystal skulls by paranormal enthusiasts was boosted by the emergence of another skull, probably the most famous of them all, the so-called Mitchell-Hedges skull. It was named after Frederick Albert Mitchell Hedges, a British author and adventurer. From the 1940s, Mitchell Hedges, and even more so his daughter, Anna, began claiming they had discovered a crystal skull inside a temple during their 1920s exploration in Belize, then British Honduras. According to their account, the skull had been buried under a collapsed altar. The skull, which they owned and displayed, was very similar to the one kept at the British Museum. The story was reminiscent of Indiana Jones, a complex artifact found in the crumbling ruins of a lost temple in the Central American jungle. exciting. Anna continued making claims about the skull's supposed powers for several decades after her father's death. Among these claims was an account from local Maya descendants who allegedly told her that ancient high priests, thousands of years ago, used the skull to bring death upon people. For this reason, the artifact became known as the Skull of Doom. Anna Mitchell Hedges maintained this narrative until her death in 2007. She arguably exploited the story, touring with the skull and exhibiting it on a pay-per-view basis. She gave interviews and occasionally added new details to her account. But was there any truth to it? No. And we know it first because the skull was not found in 1924 in Belize, as Mitchell Hedges and his daughter had claimed for so long. The skull had been bought at an auction in London in 1943, 19 years later after its alleged discovery date. This is established because Mitchell Hedges wrote about this purchase in his letters at the time, and the records of the sale were found at Sotheby's, the auction house. Second, because the skull is not ancient either. Its examination with microscopes revealed that its surface had been worked with a high-speed hard metal rotary tool, coated with a hard abrasive such as diamond, which happened to be exactly what a 20th century crystal cutter or carver would use. For this reason, the skull was dated to the 1930s. It would have been brand new when it was purchased in 1943. And given its similarities with the British Museum's skull, it is believed to be a copy, something relatively easy to do because the British Museum skull had been continuously exhibited since 1898, so anyone could see it. It is unknown whether they invented this tale about the crystal skull for attention, maybe for money, or for fun, maybe a bit of all, and also whether Anna ended up believing it or not. In any case, she hung on to her story until her death. But evidence that it was a hoax is overwhelming. Now, if this skull was a modern forgery, what about the other ones? Since the 1960s, the other known skulls at the London and Paris museums have been studied with precision microscopes to examine how they were carved. Experts have analyzed the quartz they were made of to know where it could have come from. Quartz is not perfectly pure. There are micro-inclusions of other materials that can help determine where it might have been extracted. In this case, the analysis of this particular type of quartz indicates it most probably came from either Madagascar or Brazil. That is to say, thousands of miles away from Central America. As it happens, European workshops in the 19th century crafted objects with Brazilian quartz, especially workshops in Germany. These objects were made with the modern tools of the time, of the mid-19th century. When compared with other quartz objects made in Germany at the time, the skulls from Paris and London appear strangely identical to them in terms of techniques and the tools that probably served to make them. This is why it is now believed that the skulls that surfaced in the 19th century were made in Germany with Brazilian quartz. possibly in limited series for Eugène Vauban, this antiquarian who regularly discovered one. If this is true, the explanation is basically that Vauban scammed wealthy clients with artifacts that he secretly ordered or bought in Germany. In any case, the skulls are not ancient, and the most recent one, the Smithsonian skull, appeared only 30 years ago, in 1992. A box was mailed anonymously to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., and this box contained another crystal skull, a bigger one. While the Paris and London skulls are only a few inches high, this one is 15 inches high and weighs 31 pounds, 14 kilograms. The anonymous donor claimed that it was an Aztec object. By the way, Aztec and Maya, which are the two cultures these different skulls were attributed to, were quite far apart geographically and in time. They were part of the same broad civilizational or area in Mesoamerica, but the cradle of Maya culture was in the south of Mexico and Central America, whereas the Aztecs emerged in central Mexico to the north and became a powerful empire shortly before the Spanish conquest, centuries after large Maya cities had declined. So these are really distinct cultures. This other skull, the one from 1992, that is now part of the Smithsonian collection, was also examined. It was established that it had been carved using carborundum, a modern abrasive that was not available to jewelers and gem cutters before the mid-20th century. This skull is modern and is exhibited as such by the Smithsonian as a curiosity and not an ancient artifact. Even though all the known skulls were debunked one after another in the past few decades, their fame had already been established in the paranormal and entertainment world. But there is no known trace of such skulls in the mythology and religious practices of Native American peoples. All these claims were made by outsiders from different movements like the New Age movement or the so-called neo-shamanic movements, which refers to shamanism practiced by people with a Western cultural background. These are contemporary forms of spirituality that appeared in the 20th century. And when it comes to the skulls, it seems these claims took a lot of inspiration from the anecdotes invented by Hannah Mitchell Hedges. We don't know how many crystal skulls were made and sold. Some authors close to or part of the New Age movement spoke of 13 skulls and often claimed that these were relics of ancient Atlantis. But the ones that have been identified are the ones in London at the British Museum, in Paris at the Museum of Man, and in Washington at the Smithsonian. We also know that there is another one in the U.S., the Mitchell Hedges skull, that Anna Mitchell Hedges left to her surviving husband. Apart from these, there could be others whose sale was not detected or recorded, and that remain in private collections or lie forgotten in attics or basements. They may not be ancient artifacts, but they certainly have a history of their own at this point. I am going to tell you about other artifacts that are actually ancient. But to conclude with hoaxes or artifacts that have been labeled as out of place, based on dubious dating or understanding. These hoaxes certainly constitute the majority of cases, sometimes because they were modern forgeries, not necessarily to scam people, as they could have been pranks too. One such prank that had its 15 minutes of fame about 10 years ago was called the Babylonokia, a clay tablet created as an artwork in 2012 that looked like a mobile phone. It resembled a Babylonian tablet, but with a keyboard and a screen, with the brand name Nokia added to it. This was intended as a joke or curiosity, but when a photo of it circulated online, a few proponents, or fans of alternate archaeology or fringe science, took the bait and started to claim it was a centuries-old archaeological find. There were clickbait articles about it, but obviously it was too implausible and not credible enough, so it died down quickly. This kind of viral prank or forgery is not limited to the recent past. Another example is the Acambaro Figures. Thousands of small ceramic figurines discovered in the 1940s in the Mexican city of Acambaro. These figurines represented people, animals, and creatures that strongly resembled dinosaurs. They were obviously man-made, and it was claimed that they were several thousand years old. You can imagine the implications. If true, they would have been made long before the existence of modern paleontology and the first recreations of dinosaur bodies. A huge thunderbolt for many scientific disciplines if this was true, as it would have suggested that humans and dinosaurs coexisted when they were thought to be millions of years apart. Beyond paleontology and Earth's history, some figurines were also claimed to represent ancient Egyptians, Sumerians, and bearded Caucasians from the Old World, supposedly made thousands of years ago in America. The entire timeline of human migrations would have been challenged. The story was picked up by some, particularly young Earth creationists, people who believe Earth was created a few thousand years ago, based on their interpretation of the Book of Genesis. Some of them reject the existence of dinosaurs, claiming they are an invention. But the majority accepts dinosaurs and argues that they had to coexist with mankind. This puts them at odds with mainstream science and history, from geology and paleontology to astronomy and biology. So proof that all these disciplines might be wrong, and that the history of Earth was thousands of times shorter than claimed, was a windfall for them. What if these figurines were that proof? But when the figurines were dated, it appeared that they had been fired very recently, in the 1930s or 1940s. In other words, they were brand new and had most probably been made by local farmers. There was demand to satisfy from fringe scientists and young Earth creationists who wanted to acquire them, so they kept producing more figurines, making more than 30,000 in total. But everything was fake, and this hoax was exposed in the 1970s. It is now mostly forgotten. Before discussing more serious cases, here is one final example of a hoax or forgery, and it's a good one. The Michigan Relics. These were a series of alleged archaeological finds in Michigan at the turn of the 20th century. If authentic, these could have been absolutely groundbreaking because they would have indicated contact in ancient times between America and one or more ancient Near Eastern cultures. There were coins, boxes, and cuneiform tablets, that is to say, clay tablets with cuneiform writing, the writing of ancient Mesopotamia. Some tablets even depicted biblical scenes, including Moses handing out the tablets of the Ten Commandments. What if the lost tribes of Israel had traveled to Michigan? We put this in the context of the late 19th century. Most scholars would have been very skeptical of these facts at the time, and they were indeed. But the timeline of mankind's history was still being revised regularly. The dating of objects using geological or archaeological layers where they were found was still quite imprecise, and there were no dating methods, such as radiocarbon. This was also a time when there was a frenzy to unearth ancient artifacts in America. Not only artifacts, but dinosaur bones were also actively searched for. In any case, several scholars went to examine and assess the relics that were provided in large quantities with regular finds by two men, James Scotford and Daniel Soper. Most of these scholars quickly concluded that these were forgeries, and not very good ones. Based on several observations, the cuneiform characters were indeed similar to Mesopotamian writing, but they were put in random order and made no sense. They also noted that the surface of many objects was perfectly smooth, indicating that they had been dried on a board that had been mechanically sawed. The first mechanical sawing machines appeared in the 19th century. They were not known in antiquity. Finally, they observed that the objects quickly disintegrated in water, so they could not have possibly been buried in the ground. They would have disappeared long before they were found. Despite the skepticism of the scientific community that never took these relics seriously, these Michigan relics had success with collectors and also some members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons. These Michigan relics echoed a story from one of the foundational sacred books of the Church, the Book of Mormon. It stated that an extinct society had lived on the American continent long before Europeans arrived, a Judeo-Christian society that knew and adhered to the Bible. So these discoveries were perfect to support the belief that this society existed, perhaps a bit too perfect, and it might have been that story from the Book of Mormon that inspired the forgery. Not all Mormons believed these artifacts were authentic. They had their doubts. But enough bought into the story and began to buy hundreds of them and collect them. Scotford and Soper kept uncovering objects, in reality making them, for 2 decades. In 1907, for example, they were reported to be selling copper crowns that had supposedly found on the heads of prehistoric kings. And even more impressively, they were selling copies of Noah's diary, the same Noah from the biblical flood and the ark, and they found believers who paid for this. Their fraud eventually died down after their deaths in the 1920s, and the Michigan Relics were slowly forgotten. The Mormon Church kept hundreds of them in their Salt Lake City Museum until 2003, when they were donated to the Michigan History Museum in Lansing, where they are now kept. Many more artifacts were fabricated, possibly thousands, over a period of more than 20 years. So these were examples of fraud, and I intentionally started with them. There are many more. To illustrate how one should be cautious when spectacular claims of discoveries or alternative theories are made in the fields of archaeology and history. Frauds and outlandish claims for attention or money are not rare occurrences. They abound. There were groundbreaking discoveries in the history of sciences, and as a principle, every theory should always be questioned. We really have to keep an open mind, but any claim that ignores inconvenient proof or is presented with conspiracy undertones, as if there was some sort of big archaeology out there working to hide the truth, should always be considered with extra caution. We still have different artifacts to examine, and these ones are genuinely old and raise interesting questions. First, let's talk about the Shroud of Turin. In 1578, 450 years ago, one of the most venerated relics of Christendom was transported to Turin, Italy, from Chambéry, which is now in France. At the time, both cities were part of the Duchy of Savoy. This relic was a large rectangular linen cloth, believed to be the shroud of Jesus of Nazareth, crucified, buried, and resurrected. On the shroud appeared the faint image of a man's body with a beard and shoulder-length hair. The man is rather muscular and tall. Various modern experts have measured him as being between 1.7 to 1.88 meters, 5 feet 7 to 6 feet 2 inches. An unusual but not extraordinary height for antique or medieval times. Reddish-brown stains are found on the cloth, around the forehead, the hands, and the feet, correlating with the wounds in the biblical description of the crucifixion of Jesus. In addition to the crucifixion itself, the Bible states that Jesus wore a crown of thorns. 46 years before its transportation to Turin, the cloth had been damaged by fire in the chapel where it was kept, in Chambéry. While it didn't burn completely, molten silver fell on it while it was folded, burning through it and leaving holes and darker traces. In the years following the fire, nuns repaired the cloth with various triangular patches that were sewn onto it and remain in place today. But the known record of this cloth predates the 16th century. In the 15th century, at the end of the Middle Ages, the piece was given to the House of Savoy. Its location prior to this is uncertain. Records from the 13th and 14th centuries across Europe actually mention various places where a shroud of Jesus Christ was kept and venerated. While this may sound absurd, it was not unusual in the Middle Ages. Many relics that should have been unique, such as pieces of the true cross or remains of apostles, were claimed to be in different locations. The origin of these relics was often dubious. They were acquired and offered to churches and cathedrals, sometimes brought back from the Holy Land during the Crusades. But there were gaps of several centuries where traces of these objects were non-existent, especially for relics related to the time of Jesus. It is likely that most of them were fabrications. Nevertheless, if a relic was considered credible enough, it could command high prices, even if it was just a tooth or a bone from a saint. The church was aware that people were producing and forging relics. They severely condemned the fabrication of fake relics. However, in its doctrine, relics were not seen as central to the faith. If relics could galvanize people's faith and help them pray by providing something more tangible or material to hold on to, and if they drew people to actively belong to the church, they were not considered harmful, and so their veneration was not particularly encouraged, but was tolerated and respected. The burial shroud of Jesus was no exception. There were various reports of it in different locations. Just to name a few, for example, the Byzantine emperors possessed one, but its trace was lost in 1204 during the sack of Constantinople during the Crusades. Another shroud appeared in a French village in the mid-14th century. We don't know what happened to the Constantinople shroud. While it might have traveled and ended up in Turin, this seems unlikely given the radiocarbon dating I will tell you about in a minute, which suggests the Turin shroud was made after the sack of Constantinople, if we accept the results of this dating. Though we don't know the history of this particular artifact before the 15th century, its history since then is well documented. A chapel was built for it in the 17th century, and it was regularly put on public display. It was first photographed in 1898, which is when it truly rose to fame among Catholic relics. Because in its original colors it showed a rather faint image of the body and face, but the negative image obtained by the photographer, appearing on a black rather than white yellowish background, was much more defined and visually striking. This led devotion to the Turin shroud to reach new heights. Nevertheless, its authenticity was always questioned, including by the Catholic Church, which never confirmed nor denied that it was the genuine burial cloth of Jesus. The authenticity of the shroud was questioned based on the Gospels. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke state that Jesus' body was wrapped in a single piece of linen cloth, which appears consistent. However, the Gospel of John mentions that strips of linen were used instead. According to John's version, there would not have been a shroud of Jesus in a single piece. Scientific investigation truly began in the 20th century. In 1978, pigments were taken from the shroud and examined under microscopes. The team of investigators concluded that the image was a painting. The pigments that gave the reddish color were red ochre, which would have been applied in a kind of gelatinous medium. As it happens, this technique was known and used by some painters in the 14th century. And they also found vermilion, another pigment used to highlight the alleged bloodstains but they didn't find any trace of actual blood in the samples taken from the shroud. So, in the 1980s, the theory that it could be a medieval painting gained traction. In 1988, radiocarbon dating was permitted, and additional samples were taken from the cloth. This analysis concluded that the shroud material dated from the 13th or 14th century, still old, but much too recent to have been associated with Jesus. This analysis was contested with sensible arguments. What if there had been medieval repairs to the shroud, and the samples had been taken from them instead of the original fabric? Or what if the results of the radiocarbon dating had been contaminated by carbon monoxide, since it was established that the cloth had been exposed to fire at least once? These arguments were refuted convincingly, but with the progress of radiocarbon dating since the 1980s, the results were questioned somewhat. The consensus today is that the stated date range should be extended by almost a century to be truly confident in their results. But the cloth would still be more than 1,000 years too recent to be authentic. Other approaches included examining the weaving of the fabric. The linen cloth has been a so-called herringbone weave, which means it has a distinctive V-shaped weaving pattern. This again tends to dismiss its authenticity, because this kind of weaving was absent from all known fabrics from Palestine at the time of Jesus. Yet, other approaches were tried, like anatomical analysis, attempting to determine whether the body proportions were realistic. While they seem visually accurate, and even if it is a painting, a real body could have been used as a model, possibly covered in pigments and wrapped in the cloth for a quick result. But various experts have argued that some proportions were incorrect. The arms would be too long, with a marked difference in length between them, and the forehead on the shroud would be too small. And yet another problem, a serious one, is that this image of a human body is not consistent with what you would get from wrapping a real body or statue in cloth. You would expect much more distortion of the proportions, whereas this image looks more like a photograph transferred to fabric. This raises the unsolved question of how it was made. It looks plausible, but complicated. Complicated because to be credible, the cloth already had to look old when it arrived in Savoy in the 15th century. It could have been artificially aged by exposing it to sun and dust, but that would take time and require planning. We also don't know how the image was created. It could have been painted directly, which would explain the proportion issues of the body. Although the technique employed could be consistent with methods from the 13th and 14th centuries, including the pigments known at the time and the use of collagen to create this gelatinous medium to paint on, it would still have required a master painter to achieve such a result. Another hypothesis suggests a form of medieval photography where a body was exposed to sunlight for an extended period, with its reflection passing through a lens and projecting onto the cloth. This process would have potentially allowed for the slow replication of the image onto the fabric. Although the various techniques and equipment needed would have been theoretically available in the Middle Ages, This possibility is considered highly improbable. There would be no other known examples of such a process during the Middle Ages, which is puzzling because if it had worked, it would certainly have been utilized more than once. Another hypothesis involves the possibility of transferring prints from a person covered in pigments, but doing so in small sections at a time to avoid the previously mentioned distortions. The process could have involved printing the nose, forehead, eyes, and other features progressively to recreate the complete image on the cloth. Alternatively, it could have been accomplished by wrapping the cloth around a bas-relief, not a real three-dimensional body, but rather a board carved on both sides with a two-dimensional sculpture of a man. This method could have produced the results visible on the cloth. So as you see, while the Shroud of Turin may indeed be a forgery, but at least it is an extremely well-conceived and well-executed one. It is so sophisticated that to this day, various plausible hypotheses exist, yet we still don't know precisely how it was created during the Middle Ages. Our next story is about a technical curiosity, a pillar made of iron 1600 years ago that apparently doesn't rust despite centuries of exposure to moisture. It was made in India under Emperor Chandragupta II, who reigned at the turn of the 4th century AD. It is relatively high for an antique metal structure. It stands at more than 7 meters high, which is 23 feet, with a diameter of 41 centimeters, 16 inches. The pillar is made of almost pure iron at more than 99%. This is nice, but nothing extraordinary for iron metallurgy. At this point, iron metallurgy was well established across the ancient world, and many iron objects were made in India, including centuries earlier than that. What is more intriguing is that the pillar seems to be protected against rust. Apart from traces of rust near its base, it has remained intact since its creation. It is believed that this was first erected somewhere before being moved to its current location in Delhi in the 11th century. For a long time, this resistance to rust was really puzzling, because rust-resistant steel or protective coatings on iron, which make it impervious to rust, are inventions of modern times. How could an iron pillar from the 4th or 5th century be rust-proof? And did it mean that metallurgy of ancient Indians was far more advanced than previously thought? This mystery made the Iron Pillar of Delhi an out-of-place artifact. Its existence seemed to suggest a level of technological advancement incompatible with the generally accepted timeline. So by the mid-20th century, the pillar was sometimes mentioned in fringe science circles as proof of extraterrestrial visitation, or evidence that an unknown ancient civilization would have had an advanced technological level. But further investigation provided a scientific explanation for the phenomenon, which has to do with the particular metal composition of the pillar. Even though the pillar is mostly iron, it also contains phosphorus coming from charcoal mixed with iron ore in the fabrication process. Typically, this phosphorus is considered an impurity, and in modern blast furnaces, there is much less of it because coal is used rather than charcoal, and phosphorus is evacuated, so it is absent from the finished product. But in the Pillar of Delhi, however, the concentration of phosphorus approaches 1%. And when the pillar was left exposed to atmospheric conditions, phosphorus acted as a catalyst for several chemical reactions with oxygen and hydrogen. This created a very thin protective layer on it, extremely thin, less than a millimeter thick. However, this layer isolated the iron inside the pillar, making it rust-proof or rust-resistant. The pillar did not have this property immediately when it was cast. After a few years, this protective coating appeared and made it naturally resistant to rust. So this pillar was once considered mysterious due to a lack of understanding of natural mechanisms. Since the explanation has been discovered, it is no longer considered unexplainable. So, for one last one for the road, but not the least, let me tell you about the Antikythera Mechanism. This mystery began in 1901 when the wreck of an ancient Roman cargo ship was discovered and explored near the Greek island of Antikythera. The wreck had remained at a depth of 45 meters, 150 feet, underwater for more than 2,000 years. They found considerable treasures, archaeological treasures, including bronze and marble statues. There was also glassware, jewelry, and coins. They also discovered a strange mass of corroded bronze and wood that initially did not draw much attention, because the other finds appeared more significant and interesting. Further examination revealed that a gear wheel was embedded in the object, suggesting it was some kind of mechanism. A Greek archaeologist hypothesized that it could be an astronomical clock, but most scholars considered that this was unthinkable, that the Romans or the Greeks from antiquity had created such a complex machine. So the hypothesis was not taken seriously, with some suggesting it was an artifact dropped into the sea centuries after the shipwreck. For several decades, the remains were largely ignored. They were kept together with other pieces found around the wreck and were stored with it. They attracted little interest until the second half of the 20th century. This collection of pieces, which resembled gears and metal scraps, was studied more carefully. When examined with microscopes and X-rays, it appeared that they indeed formed an ancient machine. By this point, the initial encrusted piece had fractured into smaller components through time and handling, revealing that this mass consisted of many parts: tooth wheels, spirals, and pieces with inscriptions showing the moon, calendar inscriptions in Greek, zodiac inscriptions. These components could only have belonged to a machine, a mechanism, and the inscriptions indicated this mechanism appeared to be related to astronomy. Other remains indicated that the device was contained inside a wooden box. Bit by bit, with many fragments still missing, the function of this machine was discovered. It was used to predict astronomical positions and eclipses, condensing much of the knowledge ancient Greeks had acquired about celestial cycles. Cycles of the planets they knew: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter, as well as the moon, including their slightly irregular orbits that these bodies have. The complexity of the mechanism suggests it could predict astronomical positions of these bodies decades in advance, while not matching modern accuracy. It is believed that a level of precision that wouldn't be seen again until the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, 1500 years later. While it wasn't surprising that ancient Greeks possessed such theoretical astronomical knowledge, this was already known, but their ability to implement precise engineering and workmanship this required was unprecedented. This machine basically worked as an analog computer, which is to say, one that uses physical phenomenon like the regular oscillation of something, of the movement of gears to model, calculate, solve other physical phenomena. Digital computers that we abundantly use nowadays do not work like this. They represent quantities symbolically with numbers, and they use digital signals, whereas analog systems replace one physical phenomenon with another one to be able to anticipate the first phenomenon. To give you an example, a mechanical watch with continuously rotating gears that indicate seconds, minutes, and hours is an analog computer, as the gear rotation models and follows on its own the passing of time. Such analog computers were among the first computing machines ever built. However, it was previously known that the Greeks had created one or more, likely several ones, because the complexity of the Antikythera mechanism suggests it wasn't the first of its kind. Simpler predecessors likely existed and evolved into this particular machine, though no evidence of them has been found. The dating of the Antikythera mechanism remains somewhat uncertain. It could have been made as early as 200 BC, as Hellenistic scientists of this period had just developed the necessary knowledge, particularly regarding the slightly irregular cycles of the moon. The shipwreck was dated to approximately 70 to 60 BC, providing a time window of 130 to 140 years, during which the machine could have been built between 200 BC and 60 to 70 BC. This period coincided with the expansion of the Roman Republic, both politically and commercially. Although the ship was found near a Greek island, it was Roman, indicating the rising Roman domination around the Mediterranean. During this time, Hellenistic culture, which is to say Greek culture in and out of Greece, after the expansion of Alexander the Great's empire, was highly influential in the Mediterranean and Middle East, being at the forefront of scientific discoveries and the creation of libraries. While this machine may not have changed the course of history, as far as we know it, it remains the most advanced computing mechanism produced in antiquity worldwide. No evidence of further developments has been found, and although it may not have been unique, it remains exceptional. While there was no computing science in antiquity, the device certainly brought renewed appreciation for the ingenuity of ancient astronomers, mathematicians, and engineers. After this technological know-how was lost, possibly before the end of antiquity, maybe because there was not enough interest in these machines and they were often seen as curiosities. But after that, it took about 1,500 years for astronomical clocks to emerge until the late Middle Ages in the 14th and 15th centuries. I took the example of mechanical watches to explain what an analog computer is, but large mechanical clocks also appeared in the Middle Ages, but their miniaturized versions, watches, remained rare and imprecise until the 18th century. Before that period, typically they drifted by several seconds per day. Very accurate watches only began to be manufactured in the late 18th century, and all watches remained mechanical until the development of electronics in the 20th century. Various replicas and reconstructions of the Antikythera mechanism have been made to investigate and demonstrate how it may have looked and worked. While the general principles of the machine's function are understood, many details remain unclear due to missing pieces that were either broken, lost at sea, or disintegrated in the water, where they spent 2,000 years. But who knows? Maybe one day another one of these machines will be found elsewhere and shed new light on this ancient technological marvel. We've come to the end of our little journey tonight. I hope you enjoyed this adventure, and I invite you to discover and learn more. Now you can let go and sleep. Or if you're not sleepy yet, you may pick another story from my ever-growing library. And until we meet again, good night. Sleep well.